Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining me today as I share the Cloud Edition Release 2 improvements. We're pretty excited to be able to bring you another release for our latest edition of LinkPoint Connect. This release is designed to bring additional enhancements to the core sync engine and some new features that'll just bring some more end-user productivity to you. Today's video is going to be an overview of some of the prominent features or more commonly used, I guess I'll say, enhancements that we've made to the product, but definitely make sure that you check our online knowledge base and look for this release's release notes. It's a detailed description of every single change that we made to the system so that you can be sure of exactly what changes may or may not impact your personal account sync behavior. So I'm going to go ahead and jump right in. The first thing you'll see are a couple of minor changes here. I'm logged into a test environment with a test user who's Sally here, and I'm on the home screen here. And the first thing you'll see are two small but interesting navigation changes. So you'll see we've added a home link to the navigation, and this is designed to make it a little easier for users to come back to this screen here. As we continue to build in future releases, you'll see more and more functionality added here. So we wanted to make it easier for you to find the home screen. You can also get there by clicking the big LinkPoint Connect logo up in the top left corner. The second thing that we did add was this help icon down in the footer of the site. The help icon will take you to our online knowledge base where you can see step-by-step instructions for basically every feature included in LinkPoint Connect Cloud Edition. That link is the same as this knowledge base link, but what happens is as users move through the site or they're working on different sync setting screens, we wanted a sort of stationary way for you to find the knowledge base, and that's going to be your help button here. As a reminder to everyone, as I start to dive into more of the functionality, I am logged in as an admin user. So if you are a standard user or you don't see all of these different items here at the top for the different levels of our hierarchy, and or you don't see some of the features available today, you're either not an admin or you're in a position where your admin has locked down or restricted some of the access to make your sync environment consistent based on a workflow. So it doesn't mean there's a problem, it just means you may have a different view or different access to the software. So the first thing I wanted to talk about is actually something that's been asked for quite a bit of late, and that is a notification to end users when your host gets disconnected. So as a reminder, a host is either Salesforce or Exchange, anything that you're connected to and moving data between, as you can see on my screen here. And one thing that can happen is as passwords change over time, or there are system hiccups where maybe there's a connectivity issue with Exchange or Salesforce, sometimes that causes the host to actually become disconnected. And when that happens, you'll see the big red X here. When you set up your account, you're configuring all of your account information, and then you're most likely not coming back to this portal too often because the sync will just run based on the parameters that you set. But what happens if you become disconnected? So currently, users are not notified when they have a disconnect issue, and that also means your sync stops running. So what we've added for this current release, or release 2, is, and this is a screenshot I've pulled here, is an email notification that's going to get sent to every end user when they become disconnected. And it's just a prompt saying, hey, you've been disconnected. In this case, it's Salesforce, as you can see here on my screen. If it's Exchange, it'll say Exchange or both. But the point is to sort of nudge the user, remind you, hey, we've had a disconnect. Your sync is not running right now. And it's a link to your My Settings. So you can go in, re-enter your credentials, and everything should be fine. You'll only receive one email each time you have a disconnection. And then once you reconnect, it sort of resets that counter. And then if there's a hiccup again in the future, you'll get another notification. Now, in line sort of with that disconnection, there's also a new feature we're adding, which is going to be our scheduled maintenance window notification, especially relevant with our release 2 here. When we publish changes to Cloud Edition, there may be an interruption in total service for the site. So we may have some scheduled downtime. So what I have here is actually a screenshot. And what happens is when we have a scheduled maintenance window, now every user will be presented with this little notification that you see in the top stating when the site may be down. There's also a link to our status page. The goal again is to provide a little bit more of an advance notice that there is going to be system maintenance. And as a reminder, when we have system maintenance, the site will be down and any sync that you had scheduled will not run. When the site comes back online, your scheduled sync will pick back up as normal. Now let's take a look at some of the changes that we made regarding email sync. So You're all familiar, hopefully, at this point with our email sync screens and how you can configure LinkPoint Connect Cloud Edition to either sync all of your emails or sync based on designate mode, depending on your workflow. And all of that auto matches to your Salesforce contact and lead records, depending accordingly on what you have either as a sender or recipient. New with this release is actually support for attachments. So previously, if you received or sent an email to a contact who was a match in Salesforce, the email would record based on your settings. But if you had an attachment on that email, the attachment couldn't make it back over into Salesforce. So if you revisit your email sync settings, and I'm doing this as a user, but if you're an admin, you can certainly do this at any level in the hierarchy that you have access to. And you scroll down just a bit to this little attachment section, what you'll see here is a checkbox. The first way that you can record attachments for email sync, and again, it's only email sync, not calendar yet, is to automatically record all attachments. So what that does is any email that would sync based on your sync criteria that also has attachments on it, all of the attachments on those emails will be recorded. Now, one question that we do get, and I just want to clarify, is that if you have multiple attachments on one email, there's no way currently to select which of those attachments you want to sync. So it's either all of the attachments or none of the attachments. I'll show you in a minute a way that you can sort of predictively filter them out, but just sort of as a blanket statement, it's all attachments or no attachments. And this functionality, again, is sort of an automatic. So you can set this, hit save, and then moving forward, all of your emails you send with attachments will sync those attachments in. This has support for the files object in Salesforce if you're using that. If not, they'll go to the notes and attachments section, and it'll sort of just behave as per usual. If you don't want to automatically record all attachments, but perhaps you're sending an email out and you have an attachment on it, and I know that Fred is a match and this email, maybe I'm in all mode, so I know the email will get recorded. But I want the attachment to go also, and I don't have it set to always record all attachments. One thing you can do, and if you're familiar with our smart address feature, you'll actually remember we have some of those smart tags. So either to smart record something or to not record something. We've actually built smart tags for the attachment recording as well. So to one-off record an attachment on an email that will sync, if you start typing and put your record attachment smart tag on, this tells our system definitely record the email because it would have anyway, but also record all of the attachments on this selected email. So the one option I showed you in the sync configuration is just blanket statement, record all the attachments. This one's a little bit more selective. Again, multiple attachments on here. They're all going to go, but I'll show you in a second how you can sort of filter that out. And let's take a look at that. So if you go back into your sync settings, and again, this is available at every level, but this is the user level, the My Settings page, you'll see we now have two buttons here instead of the one link. So the Ignore Emails button is your Ignore list. So if you've been using LinkPoint Connect Cloud Edition, that's still where you go if you want to omit email addresses or domains from syncing. The new feature here is actually this Ignore Files, and let's go ahead and open that up. And the Ignore Files is the page where I mentioned sort of helping to predictive filter out what gets recorded attachment-wise. When you come in, you'll see a very long list. In fact, it's everything except this last one. That was me testing. We're automatically going to help you by pre-populating some common files that either are often preferred to be excluded or sometimes have some spam or could have malicious content in it. Admins, if you want to change this, go into your subscription and you can go ahead and remove items from this. And users, this is what it'll be sort of set up for you ahead of time. And you can see I've sort of added 2 items here. Let's just go ahead and remove them and I'll show you how to add. So let's say I know most of the emails that I send back and forth have those little Twitter icons or the LinkedIn icons. And if you hit record all attachments, you're going to record all the Twitter and LinkedIn icons, and you don't want to do that. You can go ahead and add, maybe I want to exclude all the Twitter, I want to exclude anything with LinkedIn, maybe I know I don't ever want any JPEG files. Add as many as you want, 1 per line. go ahead and click the Do Not Sync checkbox and click Save. And just like that, now I can record all the attachments on an email, either automatically or one-off using a smart tag, but I know with confidence that if any of them have Twitter or LinkedIn, those should not be recording. So this interface is to kind of help you predict common things that you want to exclude. Another great use case is if you're always sending out the same file. Let's say I'm always sending out this same LinkPoint brochure to every one of my sales calls, or maybe there's a product overview one sheet, and you don't need to record it 9,000 times every time you send it to a prospect. You can go ahead and put in very specific file names as well. So based on your workflow, and again, admins, if you know there are certain pieces of content, you can go ahead and filter things out based on file names and extension types. Next, I want to share some of the changes that we made to the task sync. So let's flip back and go to the task sync. So the first thing is sort of not a visual, but I want to bring it up for everybody. We noticed when we were running task sync in our first iteration with Cloud Edition that there were some, I guess, points of confusion for the system regarding the task status. So if you're working with tasks, you'll understand that Exchange has a list of preset statuses. If you create a task in Exchange, there's a status field, and there are a very limited number of options that you can pick from. And I don't know how heavily people use Exchange for their task management, but you'll see here that this list, I believe, is not configurable. So if you start setting task statuses here, you have a very limited list to work with, which is fine. Now, if you go into Salesforce and you look at a task, you can see that this list, if you're familiar with it, can be configured. It doesn't always match what's in Exchange. This is a test environment, but I know at LinkPoint here we have a ton of different task statuses which have triggers on them and are used for reporting. So what we found is when this list here in Salesforce did not match the options that were here in Exchange, and you can see for me that they don't, that the system was getting confused about what status to plug in when there wasn't a value that matched. So moving forward, tasks with custom statuses in Salesforce syncing back down to Exchange are going to be shown with this not started status. So if you set a status in Salesforce to out for team review, and it syncs back down to Exchange, it's going to display with this not started status. But don't be alarmed, it's just sort of a limitation in Exchange. If you're working with it here and you save changes, when it syncs back to Salesforce, this default value you saw will be completely ignored, and the Salesforce status will still be there. So whatever that custom value is still there. So instead of overwriting Salesforce task statuses because there was no match in Exchange, we're just going to present this sort of placeholder when you're viewing it locally. And when it goes back to Salesforce, everything will still be intact and your reporting will still work fine. One note, again, if you do change this status here from the default we had, it will also be ignored and will save that Salesforce status for you. So we're going off the assumption if you've used a custom status in Salesforce for a task, that's the one you want to keep and not one of these possibly cookie cutter options here. The next thing we did with Task Sync is actually provide you with a sync history. So if you'll recall from the first release of Cloud Edition, we had a sync history for calendar and we had one for email. Now you'll see we have one for task, and in fact, we have one for contact, and we'll take a look at that in a minute. But I'd like to share a little bit of what you can expect to see here. The task sync history screen is a little bit dialed back from maybe what you would see on calendar and email. And the reason is tasks don't really get owned by anyone other than you as the user. Now, I know you can sort of assign them to different people in Salesforce, but remember, we're only working with the ones that you own. When you have the unresolved tab here, that's basically only going to show you anything that didn't sync because of an error. I don't have any errors, so I don't have any data here. The synced tab will show me all of the tasks that synced, which direction they went. If there's a due date on the task, you'll see it displayed here. If you don't set an actual time, it'll default to 12 a.m. That's just an Exchange feature. And the sync timestamp. If I had related any of these tasks in Salesforce, you would see an associated record. So again, you can't tie tasks to related items in Exchange, but if you had done that in Salesforce, you would also see that account or that contact listed. Click the link, it will take you into the record in Salesforce, similar to the other sync history screens. And your excluded tasks, again, a little bit more dialed down, but if you have tasks that you are filtering out of the sync, you can put the do not sync category on and exclude it. Those will show here. Remember, private items never sync, so you won't see them listed anywhere, but this will be where you see the ones you're filtering out with the category. Fully searchable, fully sortable, depending on how much data that you have here. And again, mine all went from Exchange up to Salesforce for demo purposes, but you could have them coming down as well, listing any related records. Tasks with no due date information will just show a blank. So that's not an error. It's just that this one I created and didn't give myself a timeline for it. So the system is just going to show it with a blank. Now I mentioned that we also did the same for contact sync. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. And we'll go back to our sync jobs and we'll go to the contact sync history. The contact sync history is fairly straightforward, but we did want to provide everybody a place to see exactly what the system is interacting with. Again, with your unresolved contacts, that's most likely going to be any contacts that didn't sync due to some sort of system or Salesforce error. Those would be listed here. I have none because I didn't have any errors today. And synced contacts is exactly what it sounds like. It's showing you the contact and which way it was synced from, the email address, just so you have that for a point of reference in case you're not quite sure which Jake Smith you're talking about, and the timestamp. Mine all came from Salesforce down to Exchange, so you can see my arrows are a little bit different for sync direction. If you make changes to any of those items in Exchange, they'll certainly sync back up. And you can click on any one of the hyperlinked names for the contact to view the contact record directly in Salesforce. Completely searchable, filtered, etc. Not so much a maintenance screen as some of our other sync history screens, but just sort of, again, like an audit history for you. And if things are moving a little funny, or maybe you didn't expect certain items to sync, you can always go ahead up here and revisit your sync settings and adjust those accordingly. Admins, this is a great way as well to make sure that your filters are in place and you can go into any end user, view their sync history, and make sure everything looks exactly how you expect it to look. Next, I want to share some of the changes that we've made to our Smart Address feature. Now, for anyone who might be new or hasn't quite implemented their smart addressing yet, smart addresses are unique email addresses that we generate based on a set of criteria so that you can sync calendar and email items to Salesforce what records. So the use case is typically, I'm sending emails back and forth, they're on match, they're going to match to the matching contacts, but I also want those emails to go to a specific opportunity or a specific account. So you'll generate your smart addresses for your accounts and opportunities, and you'll include those smart addresses in the BCC field of an email so that our system can one-off tag and record them to the matching record. And we do have webinars and documentation on how smart address sort of works at the high level there. What we've done for the release 2 for Cloud Edition is we've actually changed a little bit of how smart addresses are generated. Smart addresses will be created for every Salesforce object you have enabled, so account, opportunity, maybe you're using a custom object, that's fine too. We're going to pull based on multiple criteria. So currently what you're used to is that it was only based on the recently viewed table and you had to be the owner of the item. Moving forward, smart addresses are now going to be created for each Salesforce object per user based on whether the record appears in the Salesforce recently viewed table for that user, regardless of whether you own it. So if I'm working with opportunities, this is my recently viewed. I own most of these as Sally, but my colleague, Joe Burns, owns a couple. If I've recently viewed the opportunity, it will be qualified for a smart address. The second piece of criteria is that or the record is owned by the user. So maybe I have other opportunities that I haven't viewed recently, but I own in Salesforce. Those will also be created as smart addresses. As a reminder, smart addresses can only be created for objects that have a standard owner ID field and that have tasks as a child relationship, because there's nowhere for us to record the item to if the object in Salesforce doesn't have tasks as a child relationship. Another thing to note is that previously, any items that had a status of closed were automatically, so for example, this one right here is closed 1. Previously, that would not have become a smart address. And as you can see, we were testing, that will now be a smart address. So we've removed the closed filter. If you want to keep that filter or use other filters based on status, you can reach out to your account executive and our professional services team can apply those filters for you. So again, your smart addresses moving forward will be populated as a mix of either all of the records that you've recently viewed in Salesforce and or any of the records you already own in Salesforce, regardless of status. Two smaller things that we did also alter for smart address. The first is that the folder for smart address that we have in Exchange now is a true sync. So you'll see in here, I have my smart address folder. Now when the sync runs and we add to this, we're not going to do a complete deletion and rebuild of the folder. Some people may have noticed that their deleted folder was getting quite full of smart addresses. That should stop with the release. Anything new that comes in will certainly append. Anything that doesn't meet the criteria will get removed from this folder, but it'll be a little bit more lightweight for users with larger numbers of smart addresses. The reference to that also brings me to the other item, which is we have now set a maximum record count per smart address. So for each object type that you have turned on for smart address, opportunities, counts, cases, etc., there is actually a maximum count, and I believe it's 3,000 per record type. So you can still have tons and tons of smart addresses. We've just gone ahead and implemented a cap. The goal is, again, to make it a little more lightweight, especially for mobile users, where the sync is running once a day and rebuilding your contacts and causing a lot of updates. We wanted to make it as simple, as lightweight as possible. Now, like I said, we do have a full release notes documentation up on the website. I highly encourage everybody, especially our admins, just to take a few minutes and flip through that, especially for any of the syncs that you currently have enabled, just in case there's something that may affect you. But I will go through a few of the more general items that have changed in the software, outside of some of the more broad categories that I've already reviewed. The first item here is admins. If you go to your profiles list, you'll now see an active column here and the subscription indicated. So the goal behind this was to make it a little bit clearer so that you can see which profiles are active, along with a listing of which subscription they apply to if you happen to have multiple subscriptions. Most accounts will not. The real benefit here is that when you deactivate a profile, it actually turns the sync off for every single user in that profile. So if you're shifting license management around or you're provisioning different groups of people and shifting that around, this helps you stay under your license cap. So if you've bought 50 licenses and you need to deactivate a team because they're not going to use it, but you want to move it to a different sales team, that's one way to do that. And you'll be able to tell at a glance here which of those profiles are active or are not. Another change that we did make, it's not really something that I can show, but if you'll remember, as admins, when you were able to go in and you were locking settings for users at any other higher levels, you have that ability to go in and lock those settings. So admins will come in and see this little lock. You can select options. You can force the locks on. What that did for end users, what it actually visually did for end users, was it not only applied your change, locked the setting, made sure they couldn't save it. In some cases, it actually hid the setting. So when a user logged in and was trying to figure out why their data was moving the way it was, you may have pre-configured and locked designate mode to only sync on Tuesdays every 500 minutes. And none of those fields that you pre-configured and locked were visible to the user. Now they are. So users can come in, they'll see the settings that you've locked, but they'll be grayed out so that they know that they can't override your change because you did lock it. Another thing we did was we actually improved the search for importing users. So again, admins, when you go to import from Salesforce, you can actually search for full or partial names now. One of the restrictions we had before was it needed to be a full name match. Now I can just type partial name and we'll find a match. Again, these fields, name, email address, and profile, these are pulling from Salesforce. So I'm searching for my users, my colleagues, my employees to add them, but this search has been made a little bit more robust so that you can hopefully find who you're looking for a little more easily. Back to the sync jobs table. Another thing we did was we tweaked what we're showing in the sync job table. And this applies throughout the whole site. So end users, you'll see this as well. If you look over here to the far right, we now, instead of having a next run, we actually have a sync frequency column. So based on feedback, we found it more useful to display all of the sort of sync information at a high level that's been pre-configured for each sync job. So you can go into calendar and you can configure all those settings, but when you come back out or you come back here after you haven't looked at it for a couple of weeks or months and you see just the next run date, it didn't really tell you what had been preset or what to expect. So if you're wondering, well, how come my emails didn't sync? Am I in between sync sessions? What do I need to do? Log in at any level. Users, obviously, you'll want to come to your My Settings, come to your sync jobs, and you'll be able to see now the days of the week, the time frames that you're syncing, and that's local to your time zone as you've put it into the system, and then the frequency here. So we're just giving you a little bit more information so you can say, my sync last run ran at 11:25. It runs every 30 minutes. That's why it hasn't run yet. It should take care of itself pretty soon. I don't have to do anything. When you first come into the tool, another thing that we did change is we've actually, when you turn the sync on, the sync will now immediately run. And that may sound like a little nitpick, but in the beginning, when you came in for the first time and turned on calendar sync, there was some delay and it sometimes depended even on this frequency. Now what happens is new users who come in and enable for the first time, the minute you save your changes in that sync settings screen, those changes are automatically applied and the sync automatically kicks off. It may take a few minutes to finish its processing, especially the first time it runs. If you have a lot of data, it may just take a couple minutes to finish running through the queue. But you'll see that sync happen a lot more quickly as a new user. The next item I want to point out is probably more helpful for admins than maybe for end users. When you launch one of those sync setting screens, so for example, I'm on a subscription, and maybe as an admin, you're toggling between different profiles and users, and you're doing all your upfront configuration before you invite your end users, and you go into one of these sync job screens, and it doesn't really matter which ones. Previously, all we showed you in this top header was that you were on the calendar sync settings page. When you're skipping back and forth and you're configuring, it's sometimes hard to keep track of where you're applying the changes to. And that's a big deal with Cloud Edition because the changes you make up in the higher levels of the hierarchy affect everything below it. So I'm on a subscription level. I need to make sure I'm on the right subscription. So what we did is make a little change to the header, and now we're going to display the name and the type of the level you're on. So here you can see I'm on the example company subscription. If you're on a profile and you're editing a sync job there, you'll see now that I'm on the same thing. I'm on calendar, but now I know I'm on the standard user profile. So it's just sort of a reference so that you can keep track of where you are and where you're editing. Another thing that we did as far as the sync was we changed how the field validation with Salesforce works. Previously, what happened was if you had fields that you were sending to as new, so you're creating or you're updating in Salesforce, but they exceeded the max length for the recipient field in Salesforce, there were errors and the item didn't sync. So a good example of that might be the location field for a meeting. If it exceeded whatever Salesforce has the max length set to for that, instead of syncing, the item completely errored out. So you would have seen that on your unresolved tab in your sync history with a Salesforce error. Now what we've done is we've actually made sure all the fields that you're syncing back and forth on items to Salesforce are validated. If they exceed the maximum length requirement, we're actually going to go ahead and truncate that to the Salesforce limits. And that's for every field except for the body field and the subject field. So in the example I just gave, if your location field is really, really long, instead of throwing an error and not syncing the item, in Salesforce, the item will just appear shortened to the maximum length that Salesforce allows, and then the item will sync. As a reminder, the body field and the subject fields for email and calendar and task, those are either truncated or split depending on how your sync is configured, and there's more documentation on that. So this enhancement really applies to all the other fields that maybe Salesforce would have a max length for and you were previously seeing errors for. The last two things that I'm going to talk about are related, so I'll just sort of lump them together and speak about them high level. So previously, if you were setting up your sync for the first time and you decide you want to do designate mode and change some of your prevent operations options here, and you ran your sync, the sync would do exactly what you told it. So it would only sync the items that you had already put a category on or smart addressed, and it would prevent whatever you had selected to prevent. The problem we found was that when you turn this on and you run it, and then you went back and you either added a designation to past items after the sync ran, or you changed your mind about a prevent operation setting and decided, you know what, I actually do want to let it create, or I do want to let it update. The system had already looked at those items, followed these rules that you had set originally, and then basically dismissed those items as not qualifying for a sync. So when you came back here and you changed that prevent setting, or you added a CRM category after the fact, the system was ignoring those items because it hadn't cleared out that setting behind the scenes. So what we've done now is if you go back in between syncs or after an initial sync and you apply a category, that item will get picked up in the next sync. And if you had prevented items from syncing with a prevent operation selection previously, and then you remove a selection or change the selection, the sync engine will check for changes and apply the sync to anything that did not qualify but now does qualify for a sync. So that's another enhancement just to kind of reflect the flexibility that you have as a user, where you can come in, as long as your admin hasn't locked you out, and adjust your settings to meet your workflow as you get used to working with Cloud Edition. Now the system will be a little bit more responsive based on that experience that you're looking for. And that is the Cloud Edition Release 2 overview. I thank everybody for joining me today. And as a reminder, again, please be sure to check out the website for the full release notes. I did not go over every single change in the system. Just tried to pick out some highlights and things that we thought would be the most useful and the most impactful upfront for all of our users.